For centuries, the Cape of Good Hope has been a symbol of danger, discovery, and ambition. When early sailors reached this southern tip of Africa, they weren't just rounding a corner, they were pushing past the limits of the known world. Here, the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet in a violent, swirling mix of currents and weather systems. One minute it's calm, the next, towering waves and howling winds slam the coastline. Many ships never made it past. Some are still down there. And one of those ships, carrying over 600 people, met its end here in horrifying circumstances. Fewer than 200 survived. I'll come back to that story later. But the Cape wasn't just a graveyard for unlucky vessels. It became one of the most important turning points in world trade. Before the Suez Canal opened a shortcut through Egypt, this was the only way to sail between Europe and Asia. It became a lifeline for empires and a magnet for competition. And yet, there's more to the Cape than trade routes and rough seas. This one stretch of coastline has seen shipwrecks, colonial battles, daring rescues, and the rise and fall of fortunes. So why does this particular headland matter so much? And why did so many risk everything to round it? Let's find out. The Cape of Good Hope lies on the southern coast of South Africa, just over 70 kilometers from Cape Town. For centuries, many believed this was the southernmost tip of Africa, but that title actually belongs to Cape Agulhas, around 150 kilometers further southeast. Still, for generations of sailors, the Cape of Good Hope marked a major turning point, the moment where the long journey down the west coast finally bent east. The geography is striking. Sharp cliffs rise above crashing waves, the wind carves through the low vegetation, and the sea is almost always restless. From a ship, it looked like the edge of the map. On land, it's part of the protected Table Mountain National Park, drawing thousands of visitors a year. But this cape was never just a postcard view. Its position made it a gateway, or a barrier, depending on the weather. For ships navigating from Europe to Asia or back, this point could mean survival or disaster. And more than once, it meant the latter. I'll cover those shipwrecks in more detail later in the video. Before any European ship set its sights on the Cape, this coastline was already well known to the Khoikhoi, local communities who herded cattle and lived off the land here for generations. To them, the Cape wasn't a gateway or an obstacle, it was home. That changed in the late 1400s, when European powers, especially Portugal, were desperate to find a sea route to Asia. Their goal, spices, silk, and trade riches they couldn't reach by land. In 1488, a Portuguese navigator named Bartolomeu Dias became the first known European to sail around the Cape. He didn't mean to. His ship was caught in a violent storm and pushed far off course. When the weather cleared, he realized he had rounded the bottom of the continent. He named the spot the Cape of Storms. That should tell you what it felt like to sail here with no map, no radar, and a wooden hull between you and the ocean. But Portugal's king later gave it a more optimistic name, the Cape of Good Hope, because now they had a sea route toward India, and that changed everything. The waters around the Cape soon became one of the most contested routes in the world. If you could pass this point, you could reach the east and control some of the most valuable trade on the planet. That fight for control, it would bring more ships, more nations, and eventually, more wrecks. Some of them still lie beneath the waves here. I'll get to those soon. By the 1600s, sailing from Europe to Asia was big business and risky. Ships needed a place to stop, restock, and recover. That's when the Dutch stepped in. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company built a small station at the Cape, right where modern-day Cape Town now stands. It was a smart move. The Cape sat right in the middle of the trade route between Europe and the East Indies. Ships could take on fresh water, food, and care for sick crew members before heading back out into the open sea. That little station grew quickly. Farms were set up, forts were built, and slowly, a small outpost turned into a colony. But nothing stayed quiet for long. In 1795, as Europe fell into chaos during the Napoleonic Wars, the British took control of the Cape, wanting to keep it from falling into French hands. They handed it back for a short time, but returned again in 1806, this time to stay. To Britain, the Cape was more than a stopover. It was a key to global influence. Whoever held the Cape could monitor, control, or disrupt a huge slice of the world's shipping. And in the age of wooden ships and long voyages, that kind of control meant power. But over time, even the importance of the Cape would be challenged, especially when a new shortcut opened up thousands of kilometers to the north. I'll discuss that later in the video. The Cape of Good Hope has never been a quiet stretch of ocean. It's where two powerful systems, the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, clash and mix. That alone creates a volatile environment. Add to that the strong Agulhas current sweeping down from the northeast, sudden gales, and thick fog banks, and you get a recipe for disaster. Winds here can shift without warning. A calm morning can turn into a storm by afternoon, with waves tall enough to bury a small vessel. Early sailors had no forecasts, no radar, just instinct, charts, and hope. For many, it wasn't enough. It's estimated that more than 2,000 ships have been lost along South Africa's coast, many of them near this cape, and those are just the recorded ones. Countless wrecks lie undiscovered beneath the waves or scattered across remote beaches. Some of these disasters have become legend, grim proof of how unforgiving these waters can be. One of the most haunting legends tied to this coastline isn't a confirmed wreck, but a ghost ship said to still haunt the waters near the Cape. They call it the Flying Dutchman. The story goes back to 1641. A Dutch ship, caught in a violent storm while rounding the Cape, refused to turn back. The captain, known in some versions as Hendrik van der Decken, was sailing home from the East Indies when the weather turned brutal. Waves pounded the deck. The sails tore apart. The crew begged him to head for safety. But Van der Decken lashed himself to the wheel and cursed the heavens, vowing that not even God would stop him. According to the legend, that challenge was heard. A divine figure, sometimes described as the Holy Ghost, appeared on the deck in a beam of light. The captain raised his pistol and fired. His arm immediately withered at his side. The ship was cursed on the spot, to sail the seas near the Cape forever, never making landfall and bringing bad luck to anyone who saw it. For centuries, sailors have claimed to glimpse a phantom ship in the mist, its sails glowing, moving fast through impossible seas. Even into the 20th century, men on naval ships swore they'd seen it. Of course, there are plenty of real wrecks around the Cape as well, some with debris still scattered along the coast, others swallowed entirely. I'll get to those next, but the Flying Dutchman still looms large, especially for those who believe the Cape storms hide more than just wind and water. One of the most devastating losses off the Cape wasn't a story of legend, explorers, or convicts, but of people who never chose to be on board in the first place. On December 27, 1794, during a violent storm off the coast of Cape Town, the São José Paquete d'Africa, a Portuguese slave ship, was making its way along the treacherous coastline. The vessel had left Mozambique earlier that month, carrying over 500 enslaved men, women, and children bound for Brazil. Just a few days into the voyage, disaster struck. The ship ran into rough seas near the Cape of Good Hope and was thrown onto submerged rocks just off Clifton Beach. Some of the crew and over 200 enslaved individuals managed to escape to land using a rope line. But more than half of those on board drowned, still trapped below decks or swept away in the crashing surf. The survivors weren't rescued in any true sense. They were sold into slavery after reaching shore. For more than 2 centuries, the ship's final resting place remained a mystery. Only recently was it identified by an international archaeological team working with the Shipwrecks project and Aziko Museums of South Africa. Today, the wreck site adds a painful but important layer to the history of the Cape, one that speaks to its connection with the global slave trade. And as tragic as that was, it wasn't the last time lives were lost en masse near the Cape. Just a few years later, another ship would go down, not because of a storm or battle, but because it lacked one crucial piece of equipment. The result? One of the worst maritime disasters of its time. The Arniston was a British East Indiaman, a large merchant ship carrying soldiers and their families home from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. In May 1815, while rounding the southern coast of Africa, the ship ran into heavy seas and lost its bearings. Crucially, the Arniston wasn't equipped with a marine chronometer, the key navigational tool that allowed ships to calculate longitude accurately. Without it, the crew had to rely on dead reckoning and rough estimates. Believing they were safely west of the danger, the captain steered the ship toward shore, looking for shelter, but they were far off course. The Arniston struck a reef near what's now called Wanhuiskrans. The ship broke apart in the surf. Of the 378 people on board, only 6 survived. The wreck caused such public outcry in Britain that it sped up the process of fitting all naval and merchant vessels with proper navigational instruments. The tragedy also left its mark on the region. The nearby town was later renamed Arniston in memory of the disaster. And tragically, it wasn't the last time a ship filled with passengers would be torn apart by the Cape's fury. Less than 30 years later, another ship would face a storm of its own. In 1842, the convict ship Waterloo was anchored in Table Bay, just off Cape Town. It had stopped en route to Australia, carrying over 300 people, including a large number of prisoners. It should have been a safe haven, but the weather at the Cape is anything but predictable. A sudden gale swept into the bay, and the ship was driven onto the rocks near the shore. The chaos on board was horrifying. The vessel began to break apart as waves pounded it against the reef. Many of the convicts were still locked below decks. Efforts to free them came too late. Roughly half of those on board perished, many within sight of land. The disaster shocked the colony. It exposed the poor conditions aboard transport ships and the dangers of mooring in the bay during storms. In the aftermath, there were calls for better emergency procedures and more humane treatment of prisoners. But even this wasn't the most haunting tragedy near the Cape. Just a few years later, another British ship would meet disaster. And what happened during that wreck would leave a lasting mark on naval tradition. Just 10 years after the Waterloo disaster, another ship met a tragic fate off the South African coast. But this time, it became known not only for the loss of life, but for the discipline shown in the face of death. In 1852, the HMS Birkenhead was transporting British soldiers and their families to a frontier war. As it sailed close to Gansby, near the Cape of Good Hope, it struck an uncharted rock in the early hours of the morning. The iron hull tore open. Water rushed in fast. There weren't enough lifeboats. The crew quickly realized that if the soldiers rushed for them, the women and children wouldn't stand a chance. But the soldiers didn't panic. They stood firm, shoulder to shoulder on the tilting deck, allowing the women and children to escape first. Only 193 of the roughly 643 people on board survived. The event became legendary for what's now called the Birkenhead Drill, a code of self-sacrifice under pressure. It would go on to shape how ships handled evacuations for generations, but the sea would not relent. Just over 20 years later, another ship carrying settlers and families would meet a fate even worse, its fire and final hours haunting maritime history to this day. In 1874, a large 3-masted sailing ship departed from England bound for New Zealand. On board were 472 people, most of them emigrants and their families chasing the promise of a better life. Weeks into the voyage, well beyond the Cape of Good Hope, disaster struck. a fire broke out below deck. It spread rapidly through the wooden ship, turning it into a floating inferno. Panic followed. The crew tried to fight the flames while passengers rushed to the few lifeboats. Many were trapped below. Only 5 survived. The rest were either burned alive or lost at sea. Some who made it into lifeboats endured days of hunger, dehydration, and even worse, before drifting into the silence of death. It became one of the deadliest emigrant ship disasters in British maritime history. But what came next was even stranger. A ship far more modern, equipped with advanced navigation and communications for its time, left port and vanished without a trace. The SS Waratah was known as the Titanic of the Southern Seas, a new, luxurious passenger steamer traveling between Australia and England. In July 1909, she departed Durban for Cape Town with over 200 people on board. But somewhere along the notoriously rough coastline between East London and Cape Town, she vanished. No distress call, no debris, no survivors. Despite multiple search attempts, including ships and aircraft, no trace of the Waratah was ever found. To this day, it remains one of South Africa's greatest maritime mysteries. Theories range from rogue waves and shifting cargo to a sudden capsize and bad weather, but none have ever been proven. The loss sent a wave of concern through shipping communities and governments. After so many disasters, some in full view of shore, others swallowed in silence, it was clear that the dangers around the Cape needed a stronger response. In the early 20th century, authorities began taking more concrete steps to prevent future tragedies. Lighthouses were constructed or upgraded along key points of the coastline, including the Cape Point Lighthouse, perched high above the ocean to pierce through fog and storm with its beam. More than just warnings, these structures symbolized a shift toward proactive safety. Improved nautical charts, better weather monitoring, and more reliable communication systems started to replace the uncertain guesswork of earlier centuries. But even with modern tools, the sea around the Cape remains unpredictable, and no amount of planning can eliminate its danger completely. Earlier in the video, I touched on how the opening of the Suez Canal would eventually change the fate of the Cape of Good Hope, and here's where that shift really begins. When the canal opened in 1869, it offered ships a shortcut between Europe and Asia. No more navigating the long, dangerous route around the southern tip of Africa. Instead, vessels could pass through the Red Sea and Mediterranean, shaving weeks off their journey. It was a game changer. Trade routes that once depended on rounding the Cape were rerouted almost overnight. Ports along the old paths saw fewer sails on the horizon, and the Cape's role as a global choke point began to fade. But it wasn't the end of the story. The Cape remained critical as a backup. When the Suez was blocked, whether by war, politics, or the occasional container ship lodged sideways, the Cape route stepped back in. And even in calm times, some ships still avoided the Suez. Oversized tankers, hazardous cargo vessels, and certain naval fleets continued to favor the longer way around. So, while the canal shifted the spotlight, it didn't erase the Cape's importance. Instead, the Cape of Good Hope moved from being the only path to being the reliable one when others failed. Today, the Cape of Good Hope is no longer the lifeline of global sea trade, but it hasn't lost its power to impress. It's part of Table Mountain National Park, a protected area with sweeping cliffs, hiking trails, and ocean views that still stop people in their tracks. Every year, thousands visit to stand where so many ships once passed in desperation, hope, or fear. There's a sign at the point, simple but striking, that reads, "The Cape of Good Hope, the most southwestern point of the African continent." For many, it's a bucket list photo, but there's more here than just scenery. The Cape is a symbol of exploration, danger, ambition, and endurance. It marked the edge of the known world for early European explorers. It was the checkpoint for centuries of global trade, and it witnessed the worst and best of human judgment at sea. Stories of shipwrecks and survival still echo in the wind that cuts across the rocks. Tourists can visit shipwreck trails, see remnants of old beacons and signal cannons, and walk through a part of history that once shaped empires. And though technology has made the seas safer, the Cape hasn't lost its edge. Ships still round it, storms still blow in fast, and its legacy still captures the imagination of anyone who stands at the tip of Africa and looks out over the endless water. If you enjoyed this look into one of the most storied places on Earth, consider subscribing. I've got more history, legends, and forgotten tales on the way, and your support helps keep it going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.